Eleanor Vance wanted a dress that would make every woman in Charleston choke with envy. She wanted a green so bright, so unnatural, that it would look like she'd stepped out of a dream and into the governor's ballroom. What she didn't care about was that the color came from a bottle of poison. She didn't care that the girl dyeing the silk was coughing up blood. Eleanor thought she had buried her husband and her debts in the same shallow grave, but her biggest mistake was wearing her crimes to the party of the season. What no one realized, not the guests, not the suitors, not even the doctor, was that the emerald hue of that gown was the exact same arsenic that had been found in the late master's stomach. Charleston in 1850 was a place of heavy heat and heavier secrets. The air in the Vance estate felt like a damp shroud, thick with the smell of jasmine and the copper tang of blood. Down in the basement workshop, Sarah was drowning in silk, 500 yards of it. Her hands, once nimble and quick with a needle, were now covered in weeping sores. Every time she dipped the fabric into the vat of Shields green, the fumes bit into her lungs like a serrated knife. It's a color that looks like life, but it's built on death. They call it Paris green. It's a mix of copper and arsenic, and when it's wet, it's a beautiful nightmare. Sarah was 22 years old, but in the dim light of the workshop, she looked 50. She had a photographic memory for patterns. She could look at a lace trim once and recreate it perfectly. That's why she was valuable. That's why Eleanor Vance promised her that this dress, this impossible emerald monster of a gown, would be her final task. Eleanor had signed the manumission papers. She'd put them in her desk, promising Sarah her freedom the moment the final stitch was set. Sarah lived for that promise. Every time she felt the arsenic burning her throat, she thought of the papers. She thought of a life where she didn't have to smell the poison. But Eleanor Vance was a woman drowning in her own vanity. Her husband, the master of the house, had died suddenly 6 months prior. The town called it a tragic stomach ailment. The doctor, a man named Aris Thorne, had his doubts, but in Charleston you don't accuse a lady of her stature without proof, especially not when that lady is facing a mountain of gambling debts she's trying to hide. Eleanor needed a new husband, a wealthy one, and she needed him before the banks realized the Vance fortune was nothing but an empty shell. The ball was her stage, and the green dress was her armor. Sarah worked through the night. The candlelight flickered against the walls, casting long, distorted shadows. Her hands were stained a deep, sickly green that wouldn't wash off. It was under her fingernails. It was in the cracks of her skin. Silas, the house butler, watched her from the doorway. Silas had been in that house for 30 years. He'd seen the master's medicine bottles. He'd seen the way Eleanor's eyes stayed dry at the funeral. He didn't say much, but he brought Sarah extra water to wash the grit from her throat. He knew where the bodies were buried, and he knew that Sarah was being worked into an early grave. The problem started when Sarah was sent to clean the mistress's vanity. Eleanor was out, likely trying to charm the local judge over tea. Sarah's job was to polish the silver brushes, but her eyes caught on a drawer that wasn't quite shut. Inside wasn't jewelry. It was a ledger. Sarah's memory didn't just work for patterns, it worked for numbers too. She saw the entries, massive losses at the card tables, debts to men you don't want to owe money to, and then there was the receipt. It was from a chemist in the city. 2 weeks before the master died, Eleanor had purchased a significant amount of pest control, but the house didn't have a rat problem. Just as Sarah's fingers brushed the paper, the door creaked. Eleanor stood there, her silhouette sharp against the hallway light. She didn't scream, she didn't even move. She just smiled, and that was worse. She walked over, took the ledger from Sarah's hand, and slapped her across the face with enough force to draw blood. "A servant who reads is a servant who's looking for trouble," Eleanor whispered. She didn't mention the ledger again. Instead, she took Sarah to the fireplace in the parlor. She pulled out the signed freedom papers, the ones Sarah had been dreaming of, and tossed them into the flames. "A good seamstress is too hard to replace," Eleanor said as the parchment curled and turned to ash. "You'll stay here until I've no more use for you. Now get back to the silk. The green needs to be brighter. I want it to glow." That was the first wave of the nightmare. Sarah went back to the basement, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She wasn't just working for her freedom anymore. She was working for a woman who had killed her husband and was now killing her. The cough was getting worse. Every time Sarah breathed, It felt like she was inhaling needles. Her palms were raw, the skin peeling back in strips stained that permanent, toxic green. She realized then that Eleanor didn't intend for her to survive the making of this dress. Once the ball was over, Sarah would be a loose end, and Eleanor Vance was very good at tying up loose ends. But what Eleanor didn't know was that Sarah wasn't just a seamstress. She was an observer. She began to notice things around the house, the way the local judge, who was presiding over a land dispute that Eleanor was involved in, had started to develop the same stomach ailment the master had. He would come over for tea, and Eleanor would serve him herself. Sarah saw the silver-capped vial hidden in the vanity. It was a beautiful little thing, delicate and expensive. It looked like it belonged in a lady's handbag, but inside was the same white powder that went into the green dye. Silas saw it too. One evening, while Sarah was hunched over the heavy silk, trying to steady her shaking hands, Silas leaned in close. "The master didn't die of a fever, girl," he whispered. "He died because he found out about the money. And the judge? He's next. She needs that land to pay off the London creditors." Sarah looked at her green-stained hands. The poison was everywhere. It was in the vat, it was in the air, and it was in the tea. Eleanor was relentless. She would come down to the workshop 3 times a day, poking at the fabric with her lace parasol, never touching it with her bare skin. She knew the dye was dangerous. She'd heard the stories of girls in London shops losing their hair and their teeth because of the Paris green, but she didn't care. To her, Sarah was just another tool, like a needle or a pair of shears. "More dye," Eleanor would command. "I want it deeper. I want it to look like a forest at midnight." Sarah began to plan. If she was going to die in this house, she wasn't going to go alone. She started by gathering the evidence. She found more receipts hidden in the lining of Eleanor's old coats. She found the chemist's notes. Every time Eleanor threatened her with the labor camps in the swamps, Sarah just nodded and kept sewing. She was sewing something more than just a dress now. She was sewing a trap. She began to incorporate the evidence into the garment itself. Between the heavy layers of silk and the crinoline, Sarah tucked the receipts. She used her finest needles to sew them into the seams of the bodice, right where they would be pressed against Eleanor's skin. She knew Eleanor would never check the internal linings. She was too vain, too focused on how the waist looked, how the skirt moved. Sarah's hands were rotting, but her mind was sharp. She knew that the heat of a crowded ballroom, combined with the sweat of a dancing woman, would cause the arsenic in the fabric to release its fumes. The dress wouldn't just be a costume, it would be a gas chamber. One night, the chemist himself came to the back door. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the courtyard. He'd sold the dye to Eleanor, but he'd started hearing the rumors about the master's death. He wanted more money for his silence. Sarah watched from the shadows as Eleanor met him. She didn't give him money. She gave him a promise of payment at the ball. Sarah saw the way Eleanor's hand stayed on the small vial in her pocket. The chemist didn't realize he was dealing with a woman who had already crossed the line. As the day of the governor's ball approached, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. The dress was nearly finished. It was a masterpiece of lethal beauty. It shimmered with a brilliance that was almost blinding. But Sarah's cough was now bringing up thick, dark blood. Her strength was failing. She knew she wouldn't last much longer. She had to make sure that the proof was undeniable. She had to make sure that when Eleanor Vance walked into that ballroom, she was walking to her own execution. Dr. Aris Thorne had been visiting the house more frequently, supposedly to check on the judge, who was now bedridden at the Vance estate. The doctor was a sharp man, and he'd noticed Sarah's hands. He'd seen the way she flinched when she breathed. He knew the signs of arsenic poisoning, but he couldn't figure out where it was coming from. He didn't suspect the dress. Nobody suspected a dress. On the final night of sewing, Eleanor came down to the basement one last time. She looked at the gown, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "It's perfect," she breathed. She reached out, almost touching the silk, then pulled back. She looked at Sarah, who was leaning against the table for support. "You've done well, Sarah. It's a pity you won't be around to see the finish." Sarah didn't flinch. She just looked at her mistress, her eyes hollow. "The fabric isn't the only thing stained with blood, mistress," she said, her voice a rasping whisper. Eleanor laughed, a cold, dry sound that echoed in the stone room. She didn't realize that Sarah had already swapped the vials. She didn't realize that the evidence was already stitched into the very heart of her vanity. The clock was ticking, the invitations were out, the governor's mansion was being decorated, and in the dark basement of the Vance house, a dying girl held the secret that would burn the whole society down. Eleanor Vance thought she was going to a ball. She didn't realize she was going to a reckoning. The skin on Sarah's fingers was no longer skin. It was a crust of emerald green that bled whenever she moved. Every time she pulled a needle through the thick, poisoned silk, a sharp jolt of pain shot up her arm, settling in her chest like a heavy stone. But Eleanor Vance didn't see a girl. She didn't see a human being whose lungs were slowly turning into a swamp of chemicals. She only saw the dress. She saw the way the light from the oil lamps danced off the arsenic-laced fabric, creating a shimmer that no other woman in Charleston could ever hope to replicate. Eleanor was a woman who would walk over a mountain of bodies to reach a golden throne, and she was starting with the girl in the basement. The heat in South Carolina that year was suffocating. It pressed down on the Vance estate, trapping the smell of the dye inside the stone walls. It was a smell you couldn't wash off, bitter, metallic, and sweet all at once. It clung to the curtains, the carpets, and the hair of everyone in the house. The judge, who had been staying in the guest wing while recovering from his mysterious ailment, was getting worse. Sarah could hear him coughing from 2 floors down. It was a dry, hacking sound, the same sound Master Vance had made for 3 weeks before they put him in the ground. Reparaniso. Eleanor didn't just want the judge out of the way for a land dispute. She wanted his silence. The judge had been the one to oversee her husband's will, and he'd started asking questions about the missing funds. He'd noticed that the Vance accounts were leaking money like a sieve. Eleanor's gambling wasn't a secret to those who knew where to look, and the judge was looking. So she did what she always did when someone looked too closely. She made them stop looking. One afternoon, while Sarah was hunched over the bodice, trying to align the lace with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, the house butler, Silas, came in. He didn't have a tray of food. He didn't have the extra water he usually brought. He had a look in his eyes that made Sarah's blood run cold. He stood by the vat of green dye, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. "The chemist was at the gate again," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the lamps. "He wasn't asking for money this time. He was making threats. He told the mistress he knows the arsenic he sold her wasn't for no rats." The problem was that the chemist was a man of low character, but even men like that have a limit to their fear. He realized that if the judge died, and if the master's body was ever dug up, the trail would lead straight to his shop. He wanted out, and he wanted enough money to get to New Orleans before the law came knocking. Eleanor, however, didn't believe in paying for silence when a permanent solution was cheaper. "What did she do?" Sarah asked, her voice a raspy ghost of what it used to be. "She invited him to the ball," Silas said, his grip tightening on the edge of the table. "She told him she'd have his gold ready in the library during the midnight waltz, but I saw her face when he left, Sarah. She's not planning on giving him gold. She's planning on giving him the same thing she gave the master." And that's when the second wave of the nightmare hit. Sarah realized that the ball wasn't just a debut for a dress, it was a slaughterhouse. Eleanor was going to tie up every loose end in one night, the chemist, the judge, and likely Sarah herself. Because once that dress was seen, once the toxic widow had secured her next suitor, everyone who knew the truth would become a liability. Sarah's mind raced. She looked at the heavy silk, the beautiful, deadly green that was killing her. She had already sewn the receipts into the lining, but she needed something more. She needed something that would catch the eye of someone Eleanor couldn't charm or kill. She needed Dr. Aris Thorne. The doctor had been coming to the house daily to see the judge, and Sarah had noticed him lingering in the hallways, sniffing the air, his brow furrowed in suspicion. He knew something was wrong, but he was a man of science. He needed physical proof. But how do you give proof to a doctor when you're locked in a basement? The opportunity came 2 days before the ball. Eleanor had gone into the city to meet with the dressmakers for her shoes, leaving the house under the watchful eye of the overseer. But the overseer was a man who liked his whiskey, and by mid-afternoon he was asleep in the shade of the oaks. Sarah dragged herself up the stairs, every step feeling like a mile. She reached the mistress's vanity. Her goal was the silver-capped vial. She needed to make sure it was where she thought it was. As she reached for the drawer, a cold hand grabbed her wrist. Sarah gasped, turning to see Silas. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. "Don't," he hissed. "She's got traps everywhere, girl, look." He pointed to a thin, nearly invisible thread tied to the handle of the drawer, connected to a small bell hidden behind the mirror. If Sarah had pulled that drawer, the whole house would have known. "I need that vial, Silas," Sarah pleaded. "It's the only way. If the doctor sees what's in it, he can stop her." "The doctor won't see nothing if you're dead," Silas countered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a letter Sarah hadn't seen before. "I found this in the trash. It's a bill of sale, Sarah, dated for the morning after the ball. Your name is on it. She sold you to the turpentine camps down in the swamps. You won't last a week there." The room seemed to spin. The betrayal was complete. Eleanor hadn't just burned the freedom papers. She had already cashed in on Sarah's life. The turpentine camps were a death sentence for a healthy man, let alone a girl with arsenic in her lungs. The realization hardened something inside Sarah. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, burning rage. She wasn't just a seamstress anymore. She was a woman with nothing left to lose. "Help me, Silas," she said, her voice steady for the first time in months. "Help me finish the dress. But we're going to add a few things she didn't ask for." Silas looked at the vanity, then back at Sarah. He knew that if they were caught, they'd be lucky to be hanged, but he was tired of the burials. He was tired of watching good men rot while Eleanor Vance poured herself another cup of tea. He nodded slowly. They worked through the night, but they weren't just sewing. Sarah took the silver-capped vial. Silas knew how to bypass the bell, and instead of taking it, she emptied half the powder into a small pouch. She replaced the powder in the vial with common flour. Then she took the deadly white dust down to the workshop. Now reparaniso, Sarah didn't put the powder in Eleanor's food. She didn't put it in her tea. She knew Eleanor was too careful for that. Instead, she took the powder and mixed it with the final batch of stiffening starch for the dress's massive skirts. She applied it to the innermost layers, the parts that would rub directly against Eleanor's legs and waist for hours. As Eleanor danced, as her body heat rose, the starch would break down and the arsenic would be absorbed directly through her pores. But that wasn't the trap. That was just the insurance. The real move was the vial itself. Sarah took the empty silver-capped vessel and sewed a hidden pocket into the heavy folds of the skirt, right near the hip. It was a pocket that could only be opened by pulling a specific, hidden thread. Inside, she placed the vial, but not before she'd rubbed it with a chemical she'd found in the workshop, a reagent that would react with the doctor's testing kit. The next morning, Eleanor returned. She was in a foul mood, screaming at the maids because her silk stockings weren't the right shade of cream. She stormed into the workshop and demanded to see the dress. Sarah stood back, her hands hidden in her apron, as Eleanor circled the emerald gown. "It's breathtaking," Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide with greed. She reached out and stroked the silk, oblivious to the poison she was touching. "I shall be the queen of the ballroom. And you, Sarah, you should be proud. This is the finest work you'll ever do." "I know it is, mistress," Sarah said, bowing her head. "It's a dress that will be remembered for a very long time." The problem was that Eleanor's vanity made her blind. She didn't notice the way Silas was watching her from the corner. She didn't notice the slight bulge in the skirt where the vial was hidden. She was too busy imagining the looks on the faces of the Charleston elite. She was too busy planning which debts she would pay first once she had the judge's land and a new husband's fortune. But then a knock came at the door. It wasn't the chemist, and it wasn't the doctor. It was a messenger from the bank. He had a formal notice in his hand. The London creditors had lost patience. They weren't waiting until after the ball. They were sending an appraiser to the house the following morning to begin inventorying the furniture, the silver, and the slaves. Eleanor's face turned a sickly shade of grey. She snatched the paper from the messenger's hand and tore it to shreds. "Tell them to wait," she shrieked. "I will have the money by midnight tomorrow. Tell them if they set foot on my property before then, I'll have them shot for trespassing." She turned to Sarah, her eyes wild. "Is it finished, every stitch?" "It is, mistress," Sarah said. "Then take it upstairs now, and you—" She pointed at Silas. "Find the judge. Tell him I'm bringing him his afternoon tonic. He needs his strength if he's to accompany me to the governor's table." Sarah watched as Eleanor stormed out of the room. The trap was set, the clock was ticking, and the house was about to explode. But as she picked up the heavy, toxic dress, Sarah felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. She collapsed to her knees, the green silk spilling around her like a pool of stagnant water. She was running out of time. The question wasn't just whether the trap would work, it was whether Sarah would be alive to see it. The ball was only hours away. The carriage was being polished. The poison was in the seams, and in the guest wing the judge was about to take his final sip of tea. The green dress didn't just shimmer in the candlelight, it seemed to pulsate, like a living thing that had finally found its prey. As the sun began to set over the Charleston harbor, the heat inside the Vance mansion became a physical weight. It was the kind of heat that makes secrets sweat through the walls. Eleanor Vance stood in front of her full-length mahogany mirror, her eyes fixed on her own reflection. She looked like a goddess of the forest, draped in 500 yards of the most expensive, most lethal silk in the South. But what she didn't realize, what her vanity wouldn't let her see, was that the dress was already starting to eat her alive. Downstairs, Sarah was being dragged out of the basement. She couldn't walk on her own anymore. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, and every breath was a battle she was losing. Helena had demanded that Sarah be the one to lace her into the gown. It was a final act of cruelty, a way to show the girl that even as she died, she still belonged to the woman who had destroyed her. Silas held Sarah up, his hands steady on her shoulders, but his eyes were fixed on the front door. He knew the clock was ticking. He knew that the man Eleanor had sold Sarah to, a brutal turpentine camp overseer named Miller, was already on his way to the back gate. "Stand up straight, you miserable girl," Eleanor hissed, as Sarah fumbled with the corset strings. The room smelled of lavender water and the sharp metallic tang of the arsenic. Eleanor's skin was already beginning to show tiny red bumps along her collarbone, but she dismissed them as a heat rash. She was too focused on the silhouette. She wanted her waist pulled so tight she could barely breathe. She didn't realize that by restricting her lungs, she was forcing herself to inhale the toxic fumes rising from the fabric even faster. Sarah's fingers, raw and weeping with green-stained sores, moved with a ghostly precision. Every time she pulled a string, she felt the receipts she'd sewn into the lining. They were there, crisp and hidden, a paper trail of murder and debt. She also felt the weight of the silver-capped vial in the hidden hip pocket. It was the smoking gun, the physical proof that would link Eleanor to the master's death. But Sarah was fading. The room was beginning to blur, the edges of the mirror turning into a swirling mist of emerald and gold. Riparaniso, the injustice wasn't just in the work, it was in the silence. Eleanor kept talking, her voice a sharp staccato of demands. She spoke about the men she would dance with, the money she would secure, and how she would finally be rid of the stench of poverty her husband had left her with. She didn't mention the master's name once. She spoke of him as if he were a broken piece of furniture she'd finally thrown out. Sarah listened, her jaw clenched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt a cold, hard resolve settle over her. If she was going to die tonight, she would make sure Eleanor Vance never saw another sunrise as a free woman. Just as the final lace was tied, a heavy thud echoed from the guest wing. It was the sound of something, or someone, falling. Then a silence so thick you could hear the mosquitoes buzzing against the window screens. Eleanor froze. Her hand went to her throat. "Silas, go see what that was." Silas didn't have to go far. Before he could even reach the door, Dr. Aris Thorne appeared in the hallway. His face was pale, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and his hands were stained with something dark. He didn't look at Eleanor. He looked straight at the dress. He stood there for a long moment, sniffing the air, his eyes narrowing. "The judge is dead, Eleanor," the doctor said, his voice flat and dangerous. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just turned back to the mirror and adjusted a stray curl. "A tragedy," she remarked, her voice as cold as a winter frost. "He was a sickly man. I suppose the heat was too much for him." "It wasn't the heat," Thorne said, stepping into the room. He walked toward her, his boots clicking loudly on the hardwood. He stopped just inches away from the emerald silk. "I've seen this before. In your husband. The same symptoms, the same rapid decline. And now, as I stand here, I smell it again. It's not the judge, Eleanor. It's the room. It's you." The problem was that Eleanor thought she was untouchable. She laughed, a high, brittle sound that grated on Sarah's nerves. "You're reaching, Doctor. Are you suggesting my fashion choices are a medical concern? I suggest you leave before I have you escorted out for your insolence. I have a ball to attend." But Thorne didn't leave. He looked down at Sarah, who was slumped against the bedpost, her green hands exposed. He saw the sores. He saw the way her chest labored for every ounce of air. He reached out and grabbed Sarah's hand, turning it over to examine the rot. Sarah didn't pull away. She looked him in the eye, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. She couldn't speak, but her eyes told the whole story. "What is this dye?" Thorne demanded, turning back to Eleanor. "The finest silk from London," Eleanor lied, her voice unwavering. "Now get out." At that moment, the sound of carriage wheels crunching on the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of the transport to the governor's mansion. Eleanor grabbed her lace fan and her silk gloves, ignoring the doctor entirely. She swept out of the room, the heavy skirts of the green dress hissing against the floor like a serpent. She didn't look back at the dying girl who had made her beautiful. She didn't look back at the doctor, who was now certain he was looking at a killer. "Silas," Eleanor called out as she reached the stairs, "make sure Miller takes the girl tonight. I want her gone before I return. I don't want to see her green face in my house ever again." As the front door slammed shut, the house fell into a tomb-like silence. Dr. Thorne turned to Silas. "We don't have much time. If she gets to that ball, she'll charm her way out of any accusation. I need proof I can show the governor, something more than a hunch." Silas looked at Sarah. He saw the life draining out of her, but he also saw the way her hand was twitching toward the staircase where Eleanor had just disappeared. "The dress," Sarah whispered, the word a struggle. "The seams." Thorne frowned. "The seams? What are you talking about, girl?" "She sewed it in," Silas realized, his voice trembling. "She sewed the truth into the gown itself. The receipts, the chemist's notes. It's all in the lining." But there was a new obstacle, one that threatened to end everything before it began. A loud, aggressive pounding started at the back door. "Open up, I'm here for the Vance girl. I've got the bill of sale right here." It was Miller, the turpentine overseer. He wasn't a man who liked to be kept waiting, and he was known for his violence. Silas looked at the back door, then at the doctor. If Miller takes her, the secret goes with her. He'll work her until she drops and then bury her in the swamp. No one will ever know what happened in this house. The doctor looked at Sarah's rotting hands and then at his own medical bag. He had a choice to make. He could stay and try to find a way to stop Eleanor, or he could try to save this girl from a fate worse than death. But Sarah grabbed his arm with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone so frail. "The ball," she rasped. "Take me to the ball." "You'll die before we reach the gates, Sarah," Thorne said, his voice softening. "Then I'll die, seeing her." "Fall," she countered. It was then that Silas made a move. He didn't open the back door for Miller. Instead, he grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and handed it to the doctor. "Hide her in your carriage, Doctor. Miller won't search a gentleman's transport. Get her to the governor's. I'll stay here and deal with the overseer. I've lived in this house of ghosts long enough." The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The pounding at the back door grew louder, the wood beginning to splinter under Miller's heavy boots. Dr. Thorne didn't hesitate. He scooped Sarah up. She felt like nothing but bone and poisoned silk, and carried her through the side servant's entrance just as the back door gave way with a sickening crash. As the doctor's carriage sped away from the Vance estate, Sarah looked out the window at the flickering gaslights of Charleston. She could feel the arsenic fumes still clinging to her skin, but for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about the heat of the dancers, the sweat, and the way the poison would be soaking into Eleanor's skin at this very moment. But what they didn't know was that the chemist was already there. He was standing in the shadows of the governor's garden, a heavy pistol tucked into his waistband. He wasn't waiting for gold. He'd seen the way Eleanor looked at him at the gate, and he knew that a woman who could kill a husband wouldn't blink at killing a supplier. He was there to settle the debt himself, one way or another. The carriage jolted as it turned onto the long, oak-lined drive of the governor's mansion. In the distance, the sound of a waltz began to drift through the night air. It was a beautiful, elegant sound, but to Sarah it sounded like a funeral march. The final act was about to begin. The toxic widow was dancing, unaware that her gown was a death warrant and that the girl she thought she'd destroyed was coming to collect the debt. The problem was, Sarah's heart was slowing down. Her vision was failing. As the carriage pulled up to the grand entrance, she saw the emerald flash of Eleanor's dress through the tall ballroom windows. It was a beacon of death in a sea of white and gold. "We're here, Sarah," Thorne whispered, his hand on the door handle. "Can you hold on?" Sarah didn't answer. She just looked at the mansion, her eyes fixed on the green ghost in the window. The trap was set. The proof was in the seams. And as the first notes of the midnight waltz began to play, the entire social fabric of Charleston was about to be torn apart by a single, poisoned thread. Eleanor Vance thought the governor's ballroom was her kingdom, but she didn't know it was actually her court of law. She walked through the grand doors like a queen, her emerald silk dress sweeping across the polished marble. Every eye was on her. The men saw a wealthy, beautiful widow. The women saw a rival they could never beat. But what nobody saw was the invisible cloud of poison rising from her skirts. As the music started and the heat of 1,000 candles filled the room, the arsenic began to do its work. Eleanor was wearing her crimes, and the fabric was starting to scream. The ballroom was a sea of white lace and black wool, which made Eleanor's gown look like a jagged green jewel. She was dancing with a wealthy plantation owner from Savannah, laughing and fluttering her fan. But reparaniso, she was sweating. The heavy silk, stiffened with poisoned starch, was rubbing against her skin. Her legs were beginning to itch. A dull, throbbing ache was starting behind her eyes. She thought it was just the excitement, the wine, or the tight corset Sarah had laced so viciously. She didn't realize that every breath she took was filling her lungs with the same metallic death she'd fed her husband. Outside, in the shadows of the oak trees, Dr. Aris Thorne's carriage came to a halt. He didn't wait for the footman. He stepped out and reached back inside to lift Sarah. She was a ghost of a girl, her face pale as bone, her hands hidden in thick bandages to conceal the green rot. She could barely stand, but her eyes were fixed on the mansion's windows. She could see the green flash of the dress moving through the crowd. "Can you walk?" Thorne whispered. "I have to," Sarah rasped. Her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering on a grave. They didn't go through the front. Thorne used his status as a physician to move past the guards at the side entrance. He led Sarah through the servants' corridors, moving toward the main ballroom. The smell of expensive perfume and roasted meats grew stronger, but beneath it all, Thorne could smell the copper. He could smell the Paris green. It was a scent he would never forget, the scent of a dying man's room, now filling the most prestigious house in South Carolina. In the center of the dance floor, Eleanor Vance suddenly stumbled. Her partner caught her, his brow furrowed in concern. "Are you quite well, Mistress Vance? You look flushed." Eleanor tried to smile, but her lips felt numb. Her vision was beginning to blur at the edges. The green of her own dress seemed to be getting brighter, glowing with a sickly neon light that made her stomach churn. "It's just the heat," she managed to say. "I need a moment of air." She turned toward the tall French doors leading to the balcony, but a figure blocked her path. It wasn't a suitor. It was the chemist. He was dressed in a suit that didn't fit him, his face shadowed by a hat he hadn't removed. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of cheap gin. "The gold, Eleanor," he hissed. "I'm not waiting for the midnight waltz. I saw the bankmen at your house. I know you're broke. Give me the money now, or I'll tell everyone here what you bought from my shop." Eleanor's eyes flashed with a final spark of rage. She reached for the hidden pocket in her skirt, the one where she thought her silver-capped vial of medicine was kept. She planned to lead him to the shadows and end the threat right there, but her hand fumbled. The silk felt strange. Her fingers were tingling, losing their grip. She couldn't find the opening. "Looking for this?" A voice boomed across the silent gaps in the music. The orchestra faltered. The dancers stopped. Everyone turned toward the grand archway. Dr. Aris Thorne stood there, holding a small silver-capped vial high above his head. Beside him, leaning heavily on a cane, was a girl the guests didn't recognize. A girl with bandages on her hands and a gaze that could cut through stone. Eleanor pulled herself up, her vanity acting as a final brittle shield. "Doctor, what is the meaning of this intrusion, and why have you brought a servant into this house?" Thorne stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at the guests. He looked only at Eleanor. "I'm here to perform an autopsy, Mistress Vance. Not on a body, but on a lie." He walked into the center of the floor. The governor stepped forward, his expression stern. "Thorne, what is this? Explain yourself." "This woman," Thorne said, pointing at Eleanor, "is a murderer. She poisoned her husband with arsenic. She is currently poisoning the judge, who lies dead in her guest room at this very moment, and she is doing it all with the very fabric she wears to hide her debts." A gasp rippled through the room like a wave. Eleanor laughed, but the sound broke into a jagged cough. "You're insane. This is a London gown. It's the height of fashion." "Is it?" Thorne asked. He reached into his medical bag and pulled out a small glass spray bottle filled with a clear liquid, a chemical reagent he'd prepared in his lab. Fashion shouldn't kill the person who makes it, and it shouldn't kill the person who wears it. Before Eleanor could move, Thorne stepped close and sprayed the liquid onto the hem of her skirt. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a collective shout of horror went up from the crowd. Where the liquid touched the emerald silk, the fabric didn't just wet. It turned a deep obsidian black. The color bubbled and fizzed, releasing a sharp, pungent odor that made the guests nearest to her cover their noses and back away. "This isn't dye," Thorne shouted over the rising murmurs. "This is pure concentrated arsenic. It's a toxic shroud." Eleanor's strength finally failed. She collapsed to her knees, the heavy, blackened silk billowing around her. She looked at her hands, and to her horror she saw the same red bumps Sarah had. She saw her own skin beginning to react to the poison she'd forced another to handle. "It's a lie," she whimpered, but her voice was failing. Sarah stepped forward then. She didn't say a word. She simply raised her bandaged hands and began to unwrap them. The room went silent as the blood-soaked, green-stained linen fell to the floor. She revealed her raw, rotting palms to the governor, to the socialites, and to the woman who had sold her life for a dress. "She burned my papers," Sarah said, her voice small but carrying to every corner of the room. "But she couldn't burn the truth. Look in the seams." Thorne didn't hesitate. He pulled a small scalpel from his pocket. He didn't wait for Eleanor's permission. He reached down and sliced through the heavy bodice of the gown. The guests watched in stunned silence as he reached into the lining and pulled out a handful of papers. They were the receipts from the chemist, dated and signed. They were the notes documenting the gambling debts. And finally, he pulled a thin, hidden thread near the hip. A second identical silver-capped vial fell to the floor, shattering on the marble. The white powder inside spilled out, the same powder found in the master's stomach. The chemist tried to run, but the governor's guards were already on him. He began to babble, pointing at Eleanor, screaming that she'd forced him into it, that she'd promised him a share of the judge's land. It was a pathetic, desperate sound that only confirmed the horror of the room. Eleanor Vance looked up at the governor, her face a mask of sweat and peeling skin. She tried to reach out, to beg for a doctor, for mercy, for a way out of the trap she'd built. But the governor stepped back, his face filled with disgust. "Take her away," he commanded, "and call for the sheriff. This isn't a ballroom anymore, it's a crime scene." As the guards dragged Eleanor out, her beautiful green dress hissed against the floor, leaving a trail of black, toxic stains on the white marble. She was screaming about her status, about her name, about how she was a Vance, but in that moment, she was nothing but a dying woman in a ruined dress. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The state seized the Vance estate to pay off the massive debts and to provide restitution to the families of the victims. Eleanor Vance never made it to a trial. The arsenic exposure from the dress, combined with the stress of her downfall, destroyed her organs within 48 hours. She died in a cold jail cell, her skin turned the same sickly shade of green as the fabric she'd loved more than human life. Her final words weren't a confession or a prayer. She simply asked for a mirror. Silas was found at the estate, having successfully defended Sarah's workshop from the overseer Miller. When the sheriff arrived, Silas handed over the remaining ledgers he'd hidden under the floorboards. For his bravery and his assistance in the investigation, the court granted him a small pension from the estate's remaining assets. And then there was Sarah. The court, moved by the evidence and the testimony of Dr. Thorne, did something rare for 1850. They declared her a free woman, not just by the promise Eleanor had broken, but by the law of the land. They awarded her enough money from the Vance auction to move north, away from the heat and the memories of the basement. Dr. Thorne treated her for months, and while her hands would always carry the scars of the Paris green, her lungs eventually cleared. She moved to Philadelphia, where she opened a small shop. She never sewed with silk again. She worked only with plain, honest cotton, and she never ever used the color green. Repra niso, vanity is a trap that resets itself, but truth is a fire that cleanses the house. Eleanor Vance thought she was invisible because of her gold and her name. She thought she could kill a man and a girl and hide it all under a layer of fashion, but she forgot that every thread has a beginning and an end. The emerald dress became a legend in Charleston, a warning whispered to every young girl who dreamed of high society. It was a reminder that blood doesn't wash out of silk, and that the most beautiful things in the world are sometimes the most deadly. Eleanor Vance died with nothing, while the girl she tried to destroy walked into the sun, finally breathing air that didn't taste like poison. If this story of justice and the toxic truth touched you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more hidden histories. Share this video with someone who needs to know that a mask always eventually rots away. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching this from?